Welcome. As the next first ANU person to talk, it's just a marvellous event, and as someone who's read an awful lot of reports on law and technology over the last 4 or 5 years, or tech governance, reg tech if you like, this is a really outstanding piece of work, and it's an honour to be here on the stage with both the authors and my esteemed colleagues. As Philip said, I'm Bill Bateman. I'm the Associate Dean of Research at the College of Law. I'm also the Chief Investigator of the Humanising Machine Intelligence Grand Challenge Program, the Law Chief Investigator. So I spent quite a bit of time working both with Sarah and Johanna on these exact topics. So let's kick off, and I'd like to kick the first question to Elina. To help ground the discussion, could you explain what terms like inclusive digital economy and ethical AI mean, and how do these concepts manifest themselves in the Southeast Asian region?
Well, thank you, Will, and thank you to the ANU and my colleagues at the Society for such a warm welcome. It's good to be back in Australia after so long and to see old friends and make new ones. Let me get to your question. So, inclusive digital economy and ethical AI are mutable concepts, particularly in a region as diverse as Southeast Asia. So, with AI in particular, a lot of Southeast Asian policymakers are still trying to grapple with what exactly that means. And you'll see different policy documents, different statements, just only now trying to flesh out what ethical means in each particular context. But with inclusivity, there are the usual boxes to tick, right? So, how many women to include in STEM fields? How many micro, small, and medium enterprises to elevate to the digital platform. These are all very conventional benchmarks, in my opinion. There should be, and I think we fleshed this out in the report, greater consideration of how do you include different underrepresented parts of society, like the neurodiverse, like the specially abled, like the indigenous communities, which are so often shrouded in the physical realm, let alone in the virtual realm. And so I guess a short answer to your question, that I've only managed to do it in a long-winded way, is really it's still being fleshed out at the moment. And I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to have more of a discussion on what exactly those terms should mean in each particular country and the region.
We've got a marvellous panel to ask, sort of to begin to produce some answers to those difficult questions, and your report goes a long way to beginning and moving the conversation down the field. So I suppose a follow-up to both of the authors. How plugged in are Southeast Asian states to the digital economy, the global digital economy, and what have been the main changes on that front over the past 5 years?
Do you want to take that one?
I think, as we have demonstrated in the report, a lot of Southeast Asian countries are becoming more and more inclined to use the digital economy or digitalization as some sort of platform for post-pandemic recovery. And as we've shown in each country case studies, both for data and artificial intelligence, there are a lot of data protection and privacy frameworks, as well as they're starting to think about ethical AI and how that would, as Elina has mentioned, tick the boxes of what is inclusion all about, what is inclusive development all about. But also, I think in terms of not just the conventional e-commerce, we also see the rise of super apps in Southeast Asia. We have champions such as Gojek and Tokopedia. And all of these, very vibrant, particularly in countries like Indonesia, burgeoning sort of Silicon Valley outlook that inspires a lot of young and digitally savvy people in the region thinking through, not just about from the lens of what Silicon Valley is, but what really is, digital revolution in the lens of Southeast Asia.
Building, if you like, a regional VC culture.
Right.
That is so prominent and such a driver of technology.
A regional VC landscape that, of course, is still plugged in with the usual suspects of the big ICTs from the United States, but also an increasing role of companies such as Tencent, Alibaba, and also some from the European Union.
Yeah, fascinating. I think it's time to bring in some of our academic and policy experts. Johanna, what has Australia's strategy been towards building an inclusive digital economy? And do you see any significant policy divergences with the Southeast Asian jurisdictions that are in the report?
So I think the first thing for me to note on this is the different starting point that we have. So the CSIRO, our National Client Agency, did this fabulous review of digital readiness back in 2020. Singapore ranks #1 in the world out of 141 countries. Then we have Australia at 14. Malaysia at 38, Thailand at 55, Vietnam 77, and Indonesia at 77. So I think, like, for me, that's a really important point, because when you are embarking in this space and you're looking at the infrastructure, the business environment, and the regulatory structures, the startups, etc., we're starting from different positions. And so I think that is important to acknowledge. But what is also really remarkable when you look at it, and I really do commend you, Elina and Mark, it's a fabulous report, and there's so much depth and detail in there, is there is a lot of convergence, notwithstanding the fact that we are having different starting points from an infrastructure perspective. So there's convergence in the fact that the digital economy is important, something that we need to prioritise, that it's the future. There's convergence on the fact that we need to improve our infrastructure. There's convergence on the fact that we need to upskill, and that we need to, there's a real opportunity to improve government services and service delivery to the people. The most notable point of difference from a policy perspective for me when you look at it is the way in which the different countries in Southeast Asia, particularly the 5 countries that are profiled in the report, prioritise regulation and policy. Now, I have a bias in this space. I'm the director of the Tech Policy Design Centre. But it's interesting when you look at Australia's digital economy strategy, we lead, #1, is building the foundations for it to grow a digital economy. And in that space is recognising that we need to have a policy and a regulatory environment that supports and drives that. When you look at Singapore's strategy, for example, it's #4. In their list of priorities. When you look at Malaysia's strategy, it's a cross-cutting pillar, but it's sort of hidden quite a long way down into the bottom. So I think, for me, when I'm looking at this space and the differences, the points of divergence, and the priority that countries place on regulation and policy, for Australia, we consider it to be the foundation. You can't build a digital economy without it. Whereas many of the countries, particularly those profiled in the report, it's not given that same level of priority. And the one other point of divergence, I think, is research and development funding. And Singapore definitely leads the way in terms of actually putting its money where its mouth is, in terms of prioritising the research and development needed to drive the digital economy, more so than Australia.
I think, we've started to lay some really important policy and regulatory foundations, and your answer, Johanna, really highlighted the importance of state infrastructure in developing the global economy and the global digital economy, to use the right buzzword. So it's now time to bring in our resident international relations and statehood expert, Dr. Sarah Logan, whose work on statehood and the digital realm in the Asia Pacific region is second to none. So Sarah, it's a pretty big I'm
it's true that.
It's both within my marketing remit and also true. So how are emerging technologies interacting with traditional notions of statehood and power?
I could talk about this for probably 3 days straight, so I will try and see.
Yeah, of course.
The most obvious way that emerging technology is interactive, I think that's so, is that they enhance and embed power relationships between states. And when we talk about those power relationships, what we're really talking about here is great power, great power competition. So that's where our emphasis comes from when we talk about, in the report, there's lots of really great discussion about representation of international standard setting for that sort of thing. But I want to go back to your point and really go back to the role that infrastructure plays in state power and embedding existing power imbalances. So that's where discussions about the Digital Silk Road and internet, for example, cables, data centers, all those sorts of things. They embed power relationships in very different, in ways that, to me, it seems very different to shift. But I wanted to also go to a point which I think is really interesting. I'd love to hear more about what we think about is the role of market power. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how emerging markets like Indonesia, for example, can parlay their status as huge emerging markets into market power. And you see that to some extent in discussions around tax. I don't know if any of you know the story of Indonesia's relationship with Telegram and how international platforms in a way that countries like Australia have never been able to. So that is a type of power.
Could you tell us
Yeah.
quickly?
It'll be a general story.
Yeah.
I'll do the details.
Yeah.
But basically, countries like developed, saturated markets, let's say, like Australia, have no real leverage, broadly put, when it comes to international platforms and trying to get them to pay a type of tax, because those platforms are not present for tax purposes, generally speaking. A country like India, Indonesia, has a lot of leverage because the market is emerging and it's huge. So Indonesia, some years ago, engineered a discussion with Telegram, to kick them out of the country, ostensibly because of the discussions that were occurring on that about terrorism. But some of the analysis that I've read points to that being a way to make sure that Telegram did implement a structure in Indonesia that meant that they needed to pay some sort of tax. So that is a type of, I'm not sure I've got those details yet, but that general story, I think, resonates across the region. And that's a type of power, that's a type of state power. The third type of power that I want to think about here and how it relates to state power is what I would call platform power, the power of corporations in this space. They're not states. In many cases, they're as powerful as states, and including or particularly when we think about regulatory institutions. And that's something that I would like to open up discussions to get further in. You know, how should we think about them? Alibaba, Google, Microsoft. Where do they sit? And how do we think about them in terms of
and are they emanations of state power?
Well, often we think about them as if they are, particularly Chinese companies. I'm not saying that's wrong or incorrect, but I think there's more to say.
Is there a response from our other panelists? There's very interesting provocations about the different ways to think about, what it is to be a state that provides tech governance and tech regulation for the digital economy.
Yeah, I love those points about infrastructure, market, and platform powers. I think they all kind of intersect with each other in different ways. So the whole discussion about cables and data centers, that has been both long and emerging, and we see that play out with the laying of the submarine cables by Meta and Google most recently. But they're thought of very much in terms of investment potential by countries in the region, not so much as power, although Indonesia has had some discussion about that. And Indonesia in particular, I love the example about Telegram. I vaguely remember that from a few years ago. But this idea of market power and how states can assert their agency and autonomy, if you will, through market power, comes through, I think, and Will, this is your area, maybe you'd like to chip in on this, in terms of the discussions around data localization and what that means for free trade. And so very often markets like Indonesia and Vietnam are kind of dismissed as having more of a protectionist approach to data. And I think if you look at it from their point of view, it's really about trying to assert some of that market power on their own as emerging markets. And I think there needs to be a bit more nuance about how we view some of these tensions, both within countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, but also within the region. Because I think as we flesh out in the report, we try to anyway, countries like Vietnam are trying to reconcile some of those tensions between localization and free flow of data in compliance with their obligations under free trade arrangements like the CPTPP, for example. So thank you so much for bringing those up.
I think just to add as well on the issue of geopolitics and technology, and we've also discussed this in the report about this growing conversation about bifurcation of supply chains. And in my conversation with a lot of companies, both Americans, Japanese, and South Koreans, they have devised a way that, talking to Southeast Asian counterparts, the majority of them now are creating technology that caters to the US market and technologies that caters to the standards of the Chinese ones. And this is where the report comes in that asserts about autonomy, and as Elina has mentioned, agency and autonomy, how countries such as Southeast Asia have a market power and market access, but doesn't really have very strong ICT company come into play. In the report, we asserted that how can we crystallize this market power for more Southeast Asians to be part of technical standards and bodies, and how we flip the conversation knowing that Southeast Asia ranks third in terms of data generation. Of course, China and South Asia, namely India, comes first and second. But how does Southeast Asia reframe the conversation, as we mentioned in Indonesia's case, on how other Southeast Asian countries combine together and think about their combined market power to assert their agency, not just with the great powers in the region, but also with the dominant players such as Meta, Amazon, and Google.
Well, that's a perfect launch pad into the next question, which is about the position of Southeast Asian states versus the US. And I suppose the question's to Mark: how can Southeast Asia engage more substantively with the US in a data-driven economy to advance social and economic equality?
Right, I think to its credit, the Biden administration over the past couple of months have indeed launched several initiatives on this front. Last May in Washington, D.C., we had the U.S.-ASEAN Summit, and which is really very much positively received by the region, given the gesture of the Biden administration. Following that, in Tokyo, the Biden administration has also launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Although most of, particularly the IPEF is still, the details are still very scant, and the Biden administration has to work out on the details. I think two important areas that the U.S. can really engage Southeast Asia in the data-driven economy. Number one would be, as Sarah has mentioned, infrastructure. And this is where the culture in Southeast Asia of pragmatism comes in, wherein the countries such as Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines included, Thailand, are in the middle of choosing between Huawei and the U.S. doesn't have a sort of physical alternative. So that's where the question of pragmatism comes in, because at the end of the day, as Johanna has also mentioned, this notion of foundation. And a lot of Southeast Asian countries are still lacking in terms of internet connectivity. Although the IPEF has discussed a lot about digital standards, Southeast Asia is not yet in that kind of level, given the variances in digital maturity and development. So I think the United States has really need to flesh out more its concepts on IPEF that really provide public goods and infrastructure to address this. And I think in the report we mentioned Indonesia, which in the metropolis, Huawei is becoming sort of the supplier of choice in terms of 5G networks. But in the sort of outskirts of the city, Open RAN is something that a lot of people are adapting. So these are some of the sort of contention with infrastructure that the United States has to go through, and Southeast Asia's growing economy really needs to plug in. The second aspect would be in terms of capacity. And Southeast Asia is very much the center of advanced systems manufacturers. And they're growing their digital economy, but they don't have the foundational skills to defend their systems, let alone micro, small, and medium enterprises. And so, although diplomatically and politically, the IPEF and US-ASEAN summits are great for photos and photo ops, I think the current US administration has a lot to catch up in providing public goods for Southeast Asian digital economy.
Let's think a little bit more about infrastructure, because so much of what you're talking about is infrastructure capability, necessary infrastructure to build a digital economy. Before we started the panel, I was having a brief discussion with the authors of the report, and we were talking about the relationship between cybersecurity and data security and data governance, and we're talking about notable hacks and sort of data breaches. And my mind immediately went back to the 2018, Singapore, 2018 Singapore data breach, where there was 1.5 million patient records that were removed, including the Prime Minister's, and which is like half the citizenship base of Singapore. And Elina was saying that there have been other notable breaches since then. So, how important is developing, both the cybersecurity infrastructure to then launch the digital economy on top of, but also to have all the safeguards for citizens built into it that we expect from a a data governance framework within, sort of basic human rights platforms? And is that something that infrastructure, can that be developed within the region, or is that really a question of foreign direct investment or indirect investment?
Short answer to the question is so important.
Yeah.
And I think you see the seeds of that recognition in, for example, the Malaysian discussion right now is how to amend the Personal Data Protection Act to include things like mandatory breach notification, to include things like holding in the government in terms of being obliged to provide all sorts of protection, but also making governments responsible for data breaches, because a lot of these data breaches involve public data that's stored on government platforms. And so the breaches recently in the last few years in Malaysia and Indonesia both involve millions of records of ordinary Malaysians and Indonesians. And unfortunately, in Malaysia's case, we have ministers commenting on how those data breaches don't amount to national security threats, which is really unfortunate, and it shows the frame of thinking and frame of mind of policymakers at this level. So while there may be some of these misses at the leadership level, I think at the regulatory level there is a very real cognizance that providing a secure and safe cyber environment backed up by the adequate laws is going to be very important to enabling not just a secure system and secure data protection framework, but also encouraging the innovation that follows from that transparency and from that predictability of having a secure framework in place.
Very hard to launch a tech SME if you're never sure that any of your customers' data is secure, both from a market perspective and also from a kind of regulatory risk.
Right, and I think just to piggyback onto that very brief point, a lot of the larger tech companies are assisting in that regard, trying to help particularly small SMEs, micro and small and medium enterprises in being aware of those risks, but also in mitigating those risks.
Johanna, how does Australia hold up on the infrastructure? Or how does Australia compare in terms of government or the market providing the infrastructure for the cyber security infrastructure necessary to launch the digital economy, but also government taking responsibility, which is an important part of your answer. And I'd love to hear more about exactly what that means, but sort of government taking responsibility for providing regulatory infrastructure, not just physical infrastructure.
With respect to cybersecurity?
Yeah.
Look, I think Australia is actually pretty well leading in this space, in the sense that, in my view, there's sort of a progression of maturity. So you start by recognising the problem, so you don't have ministers saying this is not a national security problem. You then start, you have national strategies, and then you have regulatory frameworks that are put in place. That's about the point where Australia is now, so particularly around our critical infrastructure reforms that we have just implemented that are making mandatory cybersecurity standards for our critical infrastructure, two pieces of legislation that passed through our parliament in the last sitting of the last parliament. But I think the next step, which is the point at which you actually reach maturity, is that you have not just recognising that it exists, so you can articulate it, but you actually have implementation. And I think a lot of countries, and I say this as someone who worked for the government for a long time, are very good at articulating shiny policies and rolling out pieces of legislation, where we often fall down and we keep taking that. And when it comes to the regulation space, this is actually a really challenging space, because a lot of the knowledge and information in terms of how do you actually regulate in this space, and now I'm moving beyond cybersecurity and more generally, how do we ensure we have data protection? How do we ensure that our AI is actually operating within an ethical framework, assuming you have an ethical framework in place? But how do you actually, as a regulator, measure that when the knowledge and a lot of the actual expertise for that sits with industry? And we've actually just produced a report on tending the tech ecosystem, which is looking at that very question and in terms of how do we actually work to upskill the regulators so that they have the knowledge to act.
Johanna said she worked in government for a little while, but she was the chief cyber negotiator for Australia at the United Nations. There's few people who are better placed to express a viewpoint on that question than the one that we have on our stage today. Sarah, do you have any thoughts about the sort of the state responsibility, the infrastructure piece of this discussion, and how well Australia is stacking up? Because you have sort of a NatSec research interest as well.
I have to say that I've been out of the national security policy for some time, and I'm not. To my mind, the Australian policy space is less. Than what's happening in
Fascinating. Let's get back to the report. So, Elina, sorry, that was a bit of a divergent, but it was an interesting one. Your report stresses that there have been missing perspectives when weighing community-based and individual-based approaches to privacy and data. Given Southeast Asia's cultural, social, and political diversity, how can policymakers reconcile those differences?
I think, first of all, as Johanna mentioned, there has to be a recognition that there are missing perspectives. And I think, to be fair, and to the credit of many governments, and particularly those in the report, there is this recognition that there are pieces of the puzzle that have to be considered. But I think in our assessment, well, I don't want to speak for Mark, but in my assessment anyway, those missing pieces of the puzzle remain very conventional pieces of the puzzle. Pardon my mixed analogies, but I think, for example, we tend in Southeast Asia to look at the global north countries for models of data protection. And so the GDPR is seen as the gold standard, for example. And countries can model their regulatory frameworks based on GDPR and concepts of privacy and other notions within that framework. Of course, countries like Vietnam have also borrowed from Chinese pieces of legislation, for example. But these are all basically adopt and adapt, plug and play type approaches that Southeast Asian countries have chosen to go the path of. We don't see very much discussion or consideration of really dynamic scholarship that is taking place in Africa or Latin America, for example. And we bring that up in the report. So while we look to convenient pieces of examples in the global north, and I understand why, I think there should be greater consideration of some of the similarities that we share with countries in Africa or in Latin America to really address some of those missing perspectives. Because otherwise, we're not doing anything that really addresses or mitigates the social inequities that we currently have within the very conventional frameworks that we're trying to borrow from.
Just to add to Elina's points about missing perspectives, I think we also highlight
in the report that, in a way, we question what's the existing parlance and inclusive development. And in countries such as Thailand, there is a growing discussion about not just gender parity that involves men and women, but also the roles of the LGBTQI. Are their identities, perceptions being measured or evaluated from data sets? Or do they even exist in public policies? We talk about missing perspectives. In the report, we highlighted that not just the AI engineers and data scientists should be taking center stage. We advocate for the involvement of the creative arts, of the historians, of the anthropologists, of the sociologists, because as we have seen over the last few decades, the tech guys doesn't have all the answers.
The Bitcoin bros don't know everything.
Yeah, they don't know everything. And so
not just Bitcoin bros.
So these are like some of the missing perspectives. What we try to sort of flip the conversation and say, what are we really missing? And I think one final point of missing perspective, and this speaks to capacity building outside Australia's outreach in the region, is the presence of Southeast Asian countries in international setting bodies. Elina has intimated a lot throughout this launch about Singapore only having that kind of seat at the table. So the missing perspectives of other countries, such as Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, in these important bodies, will definitely adhere to what Johanna has mentioned about implementation. Because we can talk all about policy recommendations, but if the perspectives of these countries are not taken into account from a technical and policy regulatory aspect, I think it's not really sustainable.
And if I can very briefly just add to that, I think on the point of inclusivity of the people who are actually designing our technology, right? If we don't have inclusivity in that, then the technology that gets embedded in our lives represents only a very small part of society. And that's basically the technology that we have now, right? And one of the things I've had the privilege of doing is visiting incubators all around the world. In my previous role, you go somewhere and they want to take you and show you off their sexy, usually sort of industrial style. And what always stood out to me when I went to incubators within Southeast Asia is how diverse the people in those incubators were. In comparison to you go to Europe or you go to the US, the global north, and it's a very specific type of person. It's not so much tech bro anymore, but it's definitely hipster, right? It's a very specific type of person.
As the only person on stage with a beard and round. Take that very personally. I can't fit into the tight jeans anymore.
Anyway, I just make that observation that the diversity actually is technology more so than that.
So the exporting of American sort of both tech but also regulatory approaches to tech and the way that we frame it is also something that we struggle with in Australia. There's I wrote a report from the Noor Foundation a few years ago about regulating artificial intelligence and data-driven prediction, including in the criminal justice space. And there's, of course, a very famous American example of the Compass algorithmic systems for judging recidivism. You know, is this person who fills in these boxes on a questionnaire likely to commit crimes again? And all the relevant pressure testing of this technology is that it, overestimates the amount of times that white men will commit crimes because of the historical database that generally captures white men who have committed crimes in the past, and under captures for people of colour. And so it's a strange kind of exactly what's wrong with it is difficult to express in a lot of the prevailing viewpoints, but it is discriminatory and it is biased. It will also capture people of colour in certain cities and depending on the data set.
Are you saying it captures white men more than black men? I thought it would be the other way around.
No, it's good to pick me up. So yeah, it is more likely to capture you if you meet particular attributes, and because it was trained on data sets in Kansas and all these sort of mid Bible Belt hits of America, but it over captured black men in particular demographics, but it under captured white women, right? So it would if you were, but it didn't ask you your race, it didn't ask you what color are you, or even it did capture your gender, but it captured your relationship history, your asset base, your income base, your recidivism, sort of your criminal history, etc. The important point is that there was a similar tool implemented in Western Australia. And
shut up.
and there's some enterprising people, oh, this is rolled out in 30 states in America, and it's gone all the way through their judiciary, and the judges say, no, this is fine, nothing to see here, no discrimination here, it's totally fine, it works completely well. And then one judge in Western Australia thought, we can't, this is insane. We couldn't possibly apply this piece of technology in our criminal justice system because it's so inherently discriminatory and it's got this sort of just incredibly basic individual problems. But this goes to this core of individual versus community rights and interests, and the way that not just technology but regulatory approaches to technology are viewed through this American lens. We're Australia's in many ways a part of Southeast Asia, so it's also here that this problem arises. Fascinating. And so look, I'm not sure how I've come doing for time. I should ask I'm the moderator, but I meant to ask a higher moderator. We're up for time? We're all good? Okay.
Can I just add
yes, please.
A point on that, because what worries me, and we talked about this in the report, is that in Southeast Asia, particularly in countries such as Thailand, we're starting to roll out AI-enabled judges. That in our stakeholder consultation, a lot of Thais are actually more trusting of the AI judge rather than the conventional human judge. And so, again, this goes back to the conversation what Johanna is mentioning about foundation. Because a lot of people, we've talked about the perspective of policymakers from a regulatory approach. But now I want also to put the user at the center of the conversation. And a lot of these users, particularly in Thailand, are trusting more of the AI judge now. Because they think that it could create a better adjudication of cases. When in fact, as you just shared, most of these AI judges or AI-enabled judicial systems, the data sets that they use to create these predictions and algorithms rely on very much bias and incomplete choices. So again, it goes back again to what Elina has mentioned about perpetuating that digital inequity that goes out to, and it's another question about Southeast Asia being in this middle of, yes, we want to be part of the digitalization train, but we lack the foundational elements to be part of that conversation. And I think it speaks to this report where Southeast Asia is, do we stop and pause and think about our inadequacies in terms of our foundational? But when companies such as Microsoft approaches startup disease in Indonesia, it presents this sort of dilemma for them because, as we've seen in tech and policy and innovation, innovate first and think about the risk there. And I think in Southeast Asia, there's just so much outlook and bullishness about this. We got to get into this train of digitalization and think about the risks.
Beforehand. Before they materialize.
And so, in the report, we highlighted this notion about security and dignity by design. We often think about security by design. But as we indicated in the report, the risks that we face are not just cyber attacks. It's really about the social inequities that these vibrant digital economies in the region are also facing. But just in the face of TikTok.
Different kinds of opportunity. Sarah, how do you respond to, as someone who thinks about the state and technology, to the proposal that people are more trusting of algorithmic judges or AI judges and judicial power is such a core part of statehood and what it is to govern?
That's such a fascinating point. I think it brings to mind an adjacency thinking that I read, research that I read, conducted in Kenya and Tanzania some years ago, where I was talking about the research really tested how people trust in the democratic system change as they became exposed for the first time to extent, basically. So they read material about democratic process in their own country and also in other countries for the first time. It was a fantastic kind of natural experiment. And what the research found was that trust in democratic systems increased as knowledge about the structures of democracy increased among participants. So that's kind of like an AI judge, as it's kind of like approached by citizens as a kind of a bureaucratic structure without individuals and all the vagaries that people in history during engenders trust. But then what happened at the end of the research was that people's trust in government and their own governments fell apart after elections because they saw that the elections were in fact valid and that it wasn't a system that offered things the people and history and inequity associated in that system. And somehow that brings that to mind. What I really want to get to there is the idea of foundations. And what really struck me about the report was the way you bring in the importance of history and society and culture. Regulations are socio-cultural and associated institutional. When we see the implications of regulatory structures from not only the US but also Europe, that's something that really struck me in the report as well. When we're thinking about kind of privacy regulation, I don't think that academics a normal model entrepreneurial initiative place. And that's something that I think the report really brought forward, is the idea of foundational ideas about things like privacy, trust, citizen-state relations. Again, the about, and also I think Vietnam has a lot to say. How does a state like Vietnam move forward on things like privacy and digital economy in the shadow of its relationship with state, of its relationship with state like China, and also in the shadow of its relationship between citizens and government. So that's what I think when I think climate change and the trust that you see highlighting that.
To me, that highlights the real opportunity for Southeast Asia. So we talked about it in the context of US, Europe, Chinese regulation, and the Southeast Asia kind of sits in the middle of that. They sit in the middle of the infrastructure piece. You know, you can choose Western infrastructure, or you can choose Chinese infrastructure. And there is the opportunity piece, which the report covers, I think, incredibly well in terms of the risk of not engaging in these forums, particularly with respect to setting the standards. And you have a great quote in the report of Johanna where he's saying, whichever country controls AI will control the world. And it brings to mind just a phrase that I use all the time, which is, you control the standards, you control the technology. You control the technology, you control the world. And I just don't think there is enough attention paid on the role of tech standards in shaping the technology. What do I mean about that? By that, if you set particular privacy settings, it means that technology has to be made differently to comply with the privacy settings. It's built in so that your technology will provide you with privacy or an option of privacy. Or dignity, and I love, you know, we often talk about security by design and safety by design increasingly in Australia, but I love the idea of security and dignity by design. That's going to get baked into our technology, not because our technologists decide to do it. You know, maybe there are a few technologists who will prioritise those things, but fundamentally the large organisations that are making technology, that's not what they're going to prioritise, right? They're prioritising profit. They're prioritising delivering a service quickly, and they're not all evil. I really don't believe that tech companies are all evil, but it's not necessarily what they will be prioritising. But they will prioritise it if there is regulation and policy that says we as a country prioritise it, Southeast Asia prioritises it. And so I think the real opportunity in this space for Southeast Asia is that they recognise that they actually have a role in, we have increasing fragmentation in this space, both in infrastructure and in the regulations. And Southeast Asia sits in the centre of that. So in my view, Southeast Asia's role is actually continuing to allow interoperability of the increasingly fragmented both regulatory and infrastructure environment that we have. And there are examples where, you know, I think one that Elina and I have worked on a lot is Singapore stepping up and really engaging in the UN negotiations that I was involved in, but then also bringing the UN norms that were agreed at a high level, bringing them to ASEAN. They were the first region to take those norms and to say we will act in accordance with these norms in principle, in accordance with ASEAN. There's a lot of but they were the first regional organisation to do that, and so there are examples of the impact that can be had if countries make a decision to do it. And Malaysia's obviously been a real leader in that space as well.
Can I just piggyback on both Johanna's and Sarah's points about standards and state? So I think
it's not that we have countries agreeing in principle
to international norms, but the suite of options is still very conventional. So for example, we have indigenous communities from Australia and Southeast Asian countries, and they have a very, very different conception of data and knowledge. And some of this is being explored in countries in Africa, for example. So the idea of applying the concept of Ubuntu, the idea of I am because you are, of relations into technology, so that technology is viewed through the lens of a relational concept of technology rather than this purely rational concept of technology. That's sort of what indigenous communities in different parts of the world are looking at. But the idea of exploring these notions, of exploring indigenous data sovereignty and how that plays or does not play into traditional concepts of statehood and state power, those we haven't begun to explore yet. And I understand why, but I think we should have a discussion about that in order to seriously address if governments are sincere about their intention to address social inequities, then we really should be having a discussion about these very different perspectives play into technology.
Please do.
So I think your point about like marginalized communities and is really important, but I think it's also relevant to even majority communities. So I was struck with the report, for example, by the brief reference to privacy and how the personal level privacy laws don't really seem to play out in the same way that might be say privacy. But that at the household level, there's a concept of household privacy, which I just like, what is that? And how does that play? Like, should that play into regulation? My sense is that you're arguing that it should, those sorts of concepts. That are often majority community, but are not paid for by the kind of regulation. So if they should, then how should they? How do we get there? And your point is well taken about the speed at which development is occurring. But how can, I guess, the international community support that? How can researchers support that? I guess it's all based on anthropology.
Well, we're going to move to Q&A with the audience in just a minute. So we're going to do a final round of a sort of last closing reflections, if you like. And the question's going to be, as Southeast Asia continues its transition towards a digital economy, what is the one thing you would like to see happen in the next 12 months? And I will use the moderator's prerogative, and I will go first. Digital currencies and blockchain. Southeast Asia has been a target for enormous amounts of investment by cryptocurrency companies and crypto asset companies over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly accelerating in the last 2 or 3. But there's also been widespread examples of regulatory failure and significant damage to local economies as a result of regulatory failure on the digital currency, cryptocurrency front. So what I would like to see is a more robust attitude to creating fair and efficient markets in blockchain and the deployment of digital assets. So I would like to see. Sarah, what would you like to see?
I have to preface my comment as I have the opportunity to suggest that I would like to see anything in a region and don't listen by written full of Southeast Asia. As a researcher and as someone who's got a deep interest in the region, I would like to see a visible regional voice in international tax negotiations when they're applying to international tax negotiations around tech platforms. I watch these negotiations occur at the OECD level, and I don't have a sense as a researcher and as a citizen of Southeast Asia of what the regional approach is. I would like to see a 100-fold increase, and that's actually not that much, really, like in terms of the number of bodies, of representatives from Southeast Asia present in key emerging technology standards discussions. So for me, that would be things like blockchain, it would be things like the artificial intelligence, conversations that are happening in various different forums, in the ISO discussions. And I think that's a really measurable thing, particularly with this fabulous report that we've got the baseline. So I think what would be really great is to be able to come back in a year and see if we could actually manage to move the needle forward on that.
I would like to see an ASEAN forum, and throughout this. So I would like to have an ASEAN AI forum building on this report. And in this report, we highlighted a policy playbook that sits within the middle of the report. And to be, as Johanna mentioned, the baseline of discussing about the 5, just to very promote the 5 principles are agency, inclusion, care, equity, and reliability. And for the region to really have a more community-driven conversations, not just state level, regulatory, but more of a community-driven conversations surrounding AI, data, blockchain, and commerce and
And it could build up a digital master plan. The foundation actually really exists in for that.
I want to be pay tribute to all the good work that Johanna has done to increase representation within the UN system, particularly among women. But I would go a little further in terms of representation. So I think quantitative benchmarks are great, but in having that representation at the table in international forums in particular, I'd like to see more of a lateralization, I guess, and promotion of really original ideas through that representation. So having a Southeast Asian is one thing. Having a Southeast Asian who offers very, very different ideas to what is already out there, rather than just tweaking the ideas that are currently existing, that would really mean something in order to change the system. I'm all about shaping the system a little bit.
Good. Yeah, good. Well, look, thank you so much. I was handed a little piece of paper which says you need to finish at 3. But we can have a Q&A after 3. It also says on the piece of paper. So please don't go anywhere. And there's a networking session afterwards. But I'll hand over. The problem with moderating a group of people like this is all you want to do is get them to talk more and more and more. You don't want to cut them off. So thank you so much to all of our speakers. It's been just wonderful sharing the stage with you.